There's a moment in every person's life. A moment so small, so ordinary, so completely unremarkable from the outside. That changes everything. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with music or warning or the dramatic weight that would make it easier to recognize in time. It arrives the way the most important things always do. Quietly, in a hospital hallway, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in the form of a 10-year-old girl in a wheelchair who looked at a massive man in a prison uniform being pushed in the opposite direction and said, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" Every adult in that hallway looked away. The nurses, the orderlies, the visitors clutching their flowers and their get-well cards and their carefully maintained distance from something they didn't want to understand. Every adult looked away, except her mother, who grabbed the wheelchair handles and said, very quietly, "Lucy." No, but Lucy had already decided. And when Lucy decided something, nothing in the world was large enough to change her mind. Not her mother's fear. Not the prison uniform. Not the fact that the man in the next wheelchair was, though nobody in that hallway knew it yet, worth $3 billion. This is the story of Theodore Harlan, the man who lost everything and found it again in the most impossible place, and the little girl who gave him her kidney, and her mother who gave him her heart, and what it cost, and what it was worth. Stay with me, because I promise you, you have never heard a story like this one. Theodore James Harlan had been in Westfield Correctional Facility for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days when his kidneys began to fail. He knew the exact count because he had been counting since the first morning. The particular discipline of a man who needed to believe that every day had a number and every number had an end. It was the kind of mental architecture that kept certain men standing in places designed to make them fall. Theo had always been a standing kind of man. Before Westfield, he had been the kind of man that cities knew about without always knowing why. His name was on buildings, not prominently, not in the flashy way of developers who needed the attention, but in the quiet way of a man who had learned from his father that real power didn't announce itself. Harlan Industries. 40 years of real estate, private equity, and infrastructure development, built by his father Edmund and expanded by Theo into something that touched more of American daily life than most people realized. Hospitals, schools, transit infrastructure, the kind of development that didn't generate magazine profiles, but generated the physical bones of functioning cities. Theo had run it all from a corner office in Chicago for 11 years. He had been good at it. He had been, by every measure available, extraordinary at it. And then, on a March evening 3 years ago, a man had died. His name was Robert Paulson, 41 years old, a business partner of Harlan Industries for 6 years, a man Theo had trusted, had mentored, had brought inside the company's most sensitive operations with a confidence that had turned out to be the most expensive mistake of his life. Robert Paulson had died in a car accident on a rain-slicked Chicago expressway at 11:47 p.m. Theo had been in the car. He had walked away without a scratch. Robert had not walked away at all. The investigation that followed was thorough and merciless, and arrived at a conclusion that Theo had known was wrong from the moment he heard it stated, that the accident had not been an accident, that the vehicle's brake system had been tampered with, and that Theodore James Harlan, who had been at the wheel, was the primary suspect. There were people who wanted Theo in prison. There were people who had wanted Harlan Industries for years, and understood that the fastest way to get it was to remove the man standing in front of it. Those people had been very thorough. The evidence against Theo was circumstantial, but constructed with the precision of someone who understood how juries processed information. His fingerprints on the brake housing, explained away by his own lawyers as consistent with a man who regularly checked his vehicle, dismissed by the prosecution as consistent with a man who had tampered with it. A business dispute between Theo and Robert that had been resolved 6 months earlier, but was presented as ongoing motive. A text message, taken brutally out of context, that made a throwaway frustration sound like a threat. His lawyers had been good. The other side's lawyers had been better. Guilty. 8 years. Theo had stood in the courtroom and heard the word and felt something he had never felt before. Not fear, not rage, not the theatrical emotions of the innocent wrongly convicted. Something quieter than all of that. A kind of surrender that was also, somehow, a decision. He would serve the time. He would not appeal immediately. The appeals process would drag his name through another cycle of exposure he wasn't ready for. He would be still. He would wait. He would trust that the truth had its own timeline. He had been wrong about how long that timeline would be. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days later, a prison doctor looked at his blood work and said, "Mr. Harlan, we need to talk about your kidneys." Caroline Marsh had been a widow for 2 years when she brought Lucy to Mercy General Hospital for the 4th time in 8 months. She had been doing what widows with sick children did, moving forward because stopping was not available as an option. Getting up every morning, making breakfast, taking Lucy to school on the days Lucy was well enough, to the hospital on the days she wasn't, and somehow managing the space between those two categories of day with a grace that her friends called strength, and that Caroline privately called necessity. David Marsh had died of a sudden cardiac arrest 18 months after Lucy's diagnosis, 43 years old, healthy by every measurement his annual checkups had provided, gone in the time it took Caroline to drive to the grocery store and back. She had sat in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes after she got the call, unable to make herself go inside, and then she had gone inside because Lucy was at home with a neighbor and needed her mother in grief. Like stopping was not available as an option when you were the only parent a sick child had left. She had loved David Marsh with the deep, uncomplicated love of two people who had chosen each other young and grown up together. They had met in college in Boston, she studying nursing, he studying engineering, and had married at 26 and moved to Cincinnati because David had gotten a job there, and Cincinnati had turned out to be exactly the kind of city that rewarded people who showed up and worked hard without requiring them to perform ambition they didn't feel. They had been happy, genuinely, quietly, sustainably happy. And then Lucy had gotten sick, and then David had died, and Caroline had become the kind of woman she had always respected but never expected to be. The one who held everything together by sheer refusal to let it fall apart. Lucy's condition was called pulmonary fibrosis, with a rare genetic mutation that her specialist, Dr. Patricia Howe, explained with the particular careful honesty of a physician who respected her patients enough to tell them the truth. The lungs were scarring, slowly, progressively, irreversibly. The mutation meant the standard treatments had limited effect. There were clinical trials. There were management strategies. There were things they could do to slow the progression and improve quality of life. There was no cure. Caroline had heard this on a Tuesday afternoon in a consultation room in Mercy General and had held Lucy's hand and kept her face completely still and said, "What do we do first?" Because that was what you did. You asked what came first, and then you did that, and then you asked what came next. Lucy, for her part, had received the information about her own condition with the particular equanimity of a child who had been sick long enough to have made a kind of peace with it. She was 10 years old, and she was wise in the way that children who live close to difficult things sometimes became wise. Not old, not robbed of childhood, but with a clarity about what actually mattered that most adults spent decades trying to find. She liked drawing. She liked stories. She liked people, all people, without the filters and categories that adults accumulated. She had her mother's directness and her father's warmth, and something that was entirely her own. A quality of attention, of genuine interest in the person in front of her, that made everyone she met feel briefly like the most important person in any room. On a Tuesday in November, Caroline pushed Lucy's wheelchair through the 3rd-floor hallway of Mercy General toward the pulmonology unit. Lucy was having a hard week. The breathing had been more labored since Sunday. Dr. Howe wanted to adjust the medication protocol and monitor for 48 hours. They turned a corner, and coming toward them, being pushed by a tired-looking nurse, was a man. He was enormous, broad-shouldered, the kind of large that suggested a previous physical life of considerable force. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw was heavy with several days of beard. His hands, folded in his lap, were the hands of someone who had worked with them before circumstances had changed. He was wearing a prison uniform. Caroline's grip tightened on the wheelchair handles. She moved instinctively to the right side of the hallway, the way you moved in a city when something unfamiliar appeared. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration of a person managing their environment. The nurse pushed the man past them. He looked at the floor. And then Lucy said, "Hey." The nurse stopped. Caroline stopped. The man in the wheelchair looked up. He found a small girl in a wheelchair looking at him with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who had decided he was interesting and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Hey," Lucy said again. "Lucy," Caroline said, very quietly. "What's wrong with you?" Lucy asked him. Her voice was slightly breathless. It was always slightly breathless now, but the curiosity in it was complete and unqualified. The man looked at her for a moment. He had not been spoken to like this in 3 years. Not with this quality of simple, direct human interest. In Westfield, people spoke to him with the careful neutrality of institutions, functional, transactional, stripped of the warmth that made language feel like connection rather than procedure. His lawyers spoke to him with the measured optimism of people being paid to manage his expectations. The prison doctor spoke to him with the professional distance of someone whose job was his body rather than him. This child was looking at him like he was a person, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "My kidneys," he said. His voice was low and slightly rough from disuse. "They don't work right." Lucy nodded, processing this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm sick too," she said. "My lungs." She touched her chest lightly, matter-of-factly. "They're getting worse." "I'm sorry," he said. "It's okay," she said. "Then, what's your name?" "Theodore," he said. "Theo." "I'm Lucy." She pointed upward without turning around. "That's my mom. She worries." Caroline, who had been standing very still during this exchange, with the particular paralysis of a parent watching their child do something that was simultaneously alarming and completely characteristic, said, "Lucy, we need to keep moving." "1 second, Mom." Lucy looked at Theo with an expression of absolute decision. "Are you going to be okay?" He looked at this child, at the certainty in her face, the breathless voice, the complete absence of any awareness that she should be afraid of him, and felt something move in his chest that hadn't moved in a very long time. "I don't know," he said honestly. Lucy nodded. "I'll come see you," she said. "Which room?" "Lucy," Caroline started. "Which room, Theo?" He looked at the nurse, who had been watching this exchange with an expression caught between protocol and genuine human feeling, said, 312. 312, Lucy repeated, committing it. Then she looked at her mother. "Okay, Mom, we can go now." Caroline pushed the wheelchair forward. As they passed, she glanced at the man, at his face, which had done something in the past 2 minutes that she couldn't quite name. Something had shifted in it. Something that had been closed had opened, slightly, for a moment. She looked away. They continued down the hall. Behind them, the nurse began pushing Theo's wheelchair again, and Theodore Harlan, who had not felt hope in 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, sat in his wheelchair and looked at the hallway, where a 10-year-old girl had just vanished around a corner, and felt, against every reasonable expectation, something. Lucy came the next morning. Caroline had spent the night convincing herself that the visit wouldn't happen, that Lucy would wake up tired, that the medical team would have a full schedule, that the natural momentum of hospital days would carry them past the idea without requiring a direct conversation about why a 10-year-old should not be making friends with prison inmates. Lucy woke up at 7, ate her breakfast with unusual speed, and said, "Can we go see Theo now?" Caroline sat on the edge of the hospital bed. "Lucy, that man is sick," Lucy said. "Like me." "He's also..." Caroline paused. There was no version of this sentence that didn't sound like exactly the kind of judgment she had spent 10 years trying not to model for her daughter. "We don't know anything about him. His name is Theo, and his kidneys don't work," Lucy said. "That's enough for now." "That is not enough for now, Mom." Lucy looked at her with the particular patience of a child who had learned that her mother's worry, while real and valid and coming entirely from love, was not always the right guide to what should happen next. He looked really lonely. Caroline looked at her daughter. The breathing was labored this morning. She could hear it in the slight effort behind each word. Lucy's color was not good. The medication adjustment was doing something, but not enough of something, and Dr. Howe was coming at 10 to review the overnight readings. Her daughter was sitting in a hospital bed with bad lungs and a good heart, asking to go see a stranger in a prison uniform because he looked lonely. Caroline closed her eyes for one moment. Then she said, "After Dr. Howe's visit, we'll see." Dr. Howe's visit confirmed that the medication adjustment was helping marginally. She recommended 2 more days of monitoring. She asked Lucy how she was feeling, and Lucy said, "Fine. Can I go visit my friend?" Dr. Howe looked at Caroline. Caroline looked at the ceiling. At 11:15, she pushed Lucy's wheelchair down the hallway to room 312. She knocked. A pause. "Then come in." The room was standard hospital, the particular beige sameness of institutional spaces that had learned to be inoffensive through complete absence of character. There was a window with a view of the parking structure. A chair nobody had sat in. A television on the wall that was off. Theo was sitting up in the bed, not doing anything. Not reading. Not watching TV. Not on a phone. Just sitting. Looking at the window. He turned when they came in. And something happened in his face when he saw Lucy. A shift so immediate and involuntary that Caroline, watching from the doorway, felt it before she understood it. He hadn't expected her to actually come. "I said I would," Lucy told him, reading his expression with the accuracy that Caroline had learned to stop being surprised by. "I always do what I say." "I'm learning that," Theo said. Lucy wheeled herself, or tried to. The chair was heavy for her. Toward the bed. Caroline moved automatically to help, pushing her the last few feet until Lucy was beside him, the 2 wheelchairs and the hospital bed creating a small triangle of sick people in a beige room. "This is my mom," Lucy said. "Caroline." He looked at Caroline. She looked at him. Up close. He was larger than the hallway had suggested. The hospital bed seemed slightly undersized for him, the way furniture sometimes looked in rooms it hadn't been designed for. His eyes were dark and very still, and they held the particular quality she had noticed in the hallway. Not blankness, not hardness, but a careful management of expression that suggested a great deal happening underneath a very controlled surface. "Caroline," he said. A simple acknowledgement, not a greeting exactly, the way a man said a name when he was storing it. "Theo," she said, equally careful. Lucy, who had no patience for careful, said, "Tell us about yourself." He didn't tell them everything. This was not deception. It was the reasonable editing of a man who understood that certain truths needed context before they could be received, and that context took time, and that he had no right to assume these people had time to give him. He told them he was from Chicago, that he had been in business. He was vague about the specifics, the way he had been vague in the hallway, in the same way that people were vague about things they weren't ready to explain. That he had been in Westfield Correctional for just over 3 years, that the kidney problem had been diagnosed 4 months ago and had progressed faster than the prison medical team had anticipated, which was why he was here. He did not tell them about Harlan Industries, about the 40-year empire, about the verdict that he had spent 3 years believing would be overturned, and that his legal team, operating quietly, without the press attention that would have complicated things, was still working to overturn. He did not tell them that the man who had actually arranged Robert Paulson's death was a man named Vincent Cray, his former chief financial officer, who had been systematically embezzling from Harlan Industries for 2 years, and who had arranged the accident to silence Robert Paulson, who had discovered the fraud, and had constructed the evidence against Theo with the precision of someone who understood how to use a powerful man's power against him. He did not tell them that Vincent Cray was still free. He told them, Chicago. Business. 3 years. Kidneys. Lucy listened to all of this with complete attention, asking questions at the appropriate moments. What kind of business? Did you have a family? Do you have friends who visit? With the directness of a journalist and the warmth of someone who actually wanted to know rather than someone constructing a dossier. The last question landed differently than the others. Do you have friends who visit? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Lucy absorbed this. We'll visit, she said. As simply as that. A decision made, stated, complete. Caroline, who had been sitting in the chair by the window, the one nobody had sat in, watching this exchange with the complex mixture of emotions that had been her constant companion since the hallway, said carefully, Lucy, we have our own schedule here. We can't promise. I know our schedule, Mom, Lucy said. She looked at Theo. We'll visit when we can, which is most days. Mom brings me at 10, and we have lunch at noon, and afternoons are usually free until Dr. Howe comes at 4. Theo looked at this child who had just narrated her hospital schedule with the matter-of-fact precision of someone managing a complex calendar. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. I want to. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved again. That thing she'd seen in the hallway. That thing Caroline had noticed. Like a door that had been closed for a long time opening a crack and finding, unexpectedly, that the hinges still worked. Okay, he said. Lucy brought him a drawing the second day. She had done it the previous evening in her hospital room. A crayon rendering of 2 wheelchairs side by side. The occupants identifiable primarily by size differential, with the word FRENDS written above them in the slightly uneven lettering of a child who spelled phonetically and didn't consider this a problem. Theo held it carefully, the way you held something that was both simple and enormous. It's us, Lucy said unnecessarily. I can see that, he said. You're the big one. I noticed. Is it okay that I spelled friends wrong? He looked at the drawing. It's perfect that you spelled friends wrong, he said. She nodded, satisfied. I'm going to make you more. By the end of the first week, there were 7 drawings on the wall of room 312. The nursing staff, who had initially maintained a professional distance appropriate to a patient of Theo's particular circumstances, had begun to soften in the way that people softened when a child was involved, not dramatically, but in the small ways that added up to something real. The morning nurse, a woman named Donna, who had been at Mercy General for 19 years, had taped the drawings up for him with the particular care of someone doing something that wasn't in the job description but felt necessary. Caroline watched all of this from her position, the chair by the window, the careful distance of a mother who was present without being intrusive, who was monitoring without being obvious about it. She watched Theo with Lucy. She watched how he listened to her, with the same quality she would later struggle to describe to her friend Rita over the phone, like she's the most important person in the room, like what she's saying actually matters, like he's not waiting for his turn. She watched how he was careful with her. How he adjusted his voice when Lucy was having a bad breathing day, quieter, slower, removing the need for her to strain to hear. How he never once treated her illness as something to tiptoe around or minimize or perform optimism about. When Lucy asked him once, directly, if he was scared about his kidneys, he said, yes. No qualification, no reassurance. Yes. And Lucy had nodded and said, me too. About my lungs. And they had sat with that together, these 2 sick people, in a shared honesty that Caroline found more moving than she was prepared for. She realized somewhere around day 4, no longer sitting in the chair by the window because she was monitoring the situation. She was sitting there because she wanted to be in the room. It started with coffee. On the 5th day, Theo had 2 cups on his tray from the hospital cafeteria. The particular terrible coffee of institutional catering that was somehow always too weak and too bitter simultaneously. He looked at the second cup. I asked for 2, he said to Caroline. I don't know why. I haven't had someone to have coffee with in. He paused. A while. Caroline looked at the cup. She thought about the chair by the window, about the past 5 days of sitting in it, listening, about the way he'd said yes when Lucy asked if he was scared, and the particular quality of that yes, honest, undefended, the kind of answer you gave when you'd stopped performing for your audience. She got up and took the cup. She sat in the chair by the window. They drank their terrible coffee. Lucy was asleep. She napped most late mornings, the breathing effort exhausting her more than it used to, a change that Dr. Howe had noted with the careful concern of someone tracking a progression she couldn't stop. In the quiet of Lucy's sleeping, Caroline and Theo talked. Not about big things. Not at first. About the coffee. About the hospital food, which he said was better than Westfield's, which was the first reference he had made to his situation that carried any weight of feeling behind it. About Cincinnati. She told him about arriving there with David. About the way the city had been exactly what they needed. About the neighborhood where she still lived in the house they had bought together at 29. You stayed, he said. Lucy's school is there, she said. Her doctors. Her friends. A pause. David is buried there. He was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. About your husband. She looked at her coffee cup. Thank you. How long ago? 2 years in March. Was it? He stopped. Sorry. You don't have to. Sudden, she said. Cardiac arrest. He was 43. She paused. Healthy, we thought. The kind of thing that makes you understand that healthy is a temporary description, not a permanent condition. He looked at her. I know something about things that seem permanent not being permanent, he said. She looked at him. Not the uniform. She had stopped seeing the uniform around day 3. In the way you stopped seeing the frame of a painting when the painting was interesting enough. Just him. The stillness of him. The careful, considered way he spoke. What happened? She asked. If you want to say. A long pause. He looked at the window. A man died, he said. Someone I worked with. Someone I considered a friend. He was very precise with his words. She noticed this. The way he chose them. The circumstances were complicated. The investigation concluded that I was responsible. I was not. A beat. That's the short version. What's the long version? He looked at her. The long version, he said, requires a level of trust one haven't had reason to extend in some time. She held his gaze. That's fair, she said. They finished the terrible coffee in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Lucy slept. Outside the window, the parking structure sat in the November gray, indifferent and ordinary. Inside room 312, something was beginning that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. It was a Thursday when Lucy said it. She had been quieter than usual that morning. The breathing was difficult, more so than the previous days, and Dr. Howe had been in twice to adjust something in the medication delivery. Lucy had endured all of this with her characteristic patience, and then, when the doctors were gone, and it was just the 3 of them in room 312, she had looked at Theo with the expression that Caroline had come to recognize as Lucy who has decided something. Theo, she said. Yes. Do you have kids? No. Brothers? Sisters? A younger brother, he said. We're not. We haven't spoken in some time. Lucy processed this. That's sad. Yes, he said simply. Do you have anyone? He looked at her. The question, from anyone else, would have been intrusive. From Lucy, it was just accurate. Not really, he said. Lucy nodded slowly. I've been thinking, she said. Caroline, who had learned to pay close attention when Lucy began a sentence this way, looked up from the book she wasn't reading. About your kidneys, Lucy said. What about them? Theo said. You need a new one, she said. Or 2. But one would help. Right, that's what the doctors say, he said carefully. I have 2 kidneys, Lucy said. The room was very quiet. Caroline set down the book. Lucy, she said. I looked it up. Lucy said. You can live with 1 kidney. Lots of people do. And if I gave you one of mine. Lucy. Caroline's voice was very controlled. The voice of a woman keeping something large and sharp very carefully contained. Stop, Mom. No. She stood up. No, Lucy. We are not having this conversation. We're already having it, Lucy said, with the infuriating logic of a child who understood that naming a conversation was not the same as choosing it. Absolutely not. Caroline looked at Theo, at his face, which had gone very still, the way it went still when something was landing that he was processing carefully. I'm sorry. She doesn't. I do mean it, Lucy said. You are 10 years old, Caroline said, and you are sick. And this is not. I know I'm sick, Mom. Lucy said it quietly, not defensively, just stating. That's why it makes sense. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Caroline had ever sat inside. She looked at her daughter, at the slight rise and fall of her chest that took more effort than it should, at the absolute clarity in her eyes, not reckless, not dramatic, just completely, quietly certain. She looked at Theo. He was looking at Lucy with an expression she couldn't classify, something vast and complex moving behind his eyes. Lucy, he said gently, your mother is right. This isn't something. You're going to die without a kidney, Lucy said. The doctor told the nurse, and the nurse told me when she thought I was asleep. A beat. I wasn't asleep. Theo closed his eyes for a moment. I know, he said. And I have one I'm not using, Lucy said. You are using it, Caroline said. Her voice had changed. Something had broken through the controlled surface. Lucy, you are using both of your kidneys, and you need them, and this conversation is over. Lucy looked at her mother. Okay, Mom, she said. But the way she said it, the quiet, particular way, told Caroline that the conversation was not over. It was only beginning. Caroline called her friend Rita that night from her own hospital room. They had given her an adjacent room given the extended stay, and said, she wants to give him her kidney. Rita was quiet for a moment. Tell me everything, Rita said. Caroline told her everything. The hallway, the drawings on the wall, the terrible coffee, the conversation that afternoon, all of it. When she finished, Rita said, how are you feeling about him? The man. That's not the point. Caroline. Rita. How are you feeling about him? A long pause. I don't know, Caroline said. He's not what I expected. From the uniform, from there. He's very careful. Very honest. He doesn't perform anything. He just is. And Lucy loves him, Rita said. Lucy loves everyone. Lucy doesn't propose giving her kidney to everyone. Caroline was quiet. She's dying, Rita, she said. The words, said plainly, felt like dropping something heavy. I know we don't say it that way. Dr. House says progressive and managed and quality of life. But she's dying. And she knows it. And she wants. She stopped. She wants to leave something behind, Rita said softly. Caroline couldn't speak for a moment. She's 10, she finally said. She's the bravest person you know, Rita said, which she got from somewhere. Caroline sat in the dark of her hospital room and listened to the sound of her own breathing and thought about her daughter 2 rooms away and the man in the prison uniform who had said yes when Lucy asked if he was scared, and the drawings on the wall of room 312, and the terrible coffee, and the way he had looked at Lucy that afternoon when she'd made her proposal, like she was something he couldn't understand but was absolutely certain was real. She didn't sleep until almost 3. The argument lasted 4 days. This was not one argument. It was the same argument, revisited every morning with Lucy's particular persistence. She brought it up at breakfast. She brought it up during medication. She brought it up when Dr. Howe was present, which forced the doctor to address it medically rather than simply as a parenting issue, which was both inconvenient and, Caroline suspected, Lucy's strategy. Dr. Howe's medical position was careful and honest. A kidney donation from Lucy was not impossible in principle, but given Lucy's primary condition, the surgical risk was elevated. The remaining kidney would need to function perfectly. The recovery would be harder for Lucy than for a healthy donor. There were significant considerations. She did not say impossible. Caroline wished she had said impossible. Theo's position was the clearest. No. He said it to Lucy directly, every time she raised it, with a gentleness that didn't soften the firmness. No, Lucy. I won't allow it. You can't stop me, Lucy said. It's my kidney. You're 10. Almost 11. Almost 11-year-olds don't make medical decisions without their parents. Then I'll convince my mom. Your mom has more sense than both of us. Mom has a lot of sense, Lucy agreed. But she also knows I'm right. Lucy. Theo. She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. You're going to die. Maybe. Not maybe. Dr. House said the wait list is very long, and your blood type is hard to match in. You talk to Dr. Howe about my chart. She left it on the table. I read fast. He looked at her for a long moment. Lucy, he said, even if I said yes, which I'm not, your mother would never agree. She will, Lucy said. She won't. She will because she loves me, and she knows that the thing I want most in the world right now is for you to be okay. A pause. The breathing was labored today, and she knows I'm running out of time to want things. The room was very quiet. Theo looked at this child, at the absolute clarity of her, the complete unsentimentality of what she just said, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. The particular grief of being loved by someone you cannot protect. She made the decision alone. Not because Theo was unavailable. He was 2 rooms away, and she could have walked there at any point. Not because she lacked people to consult. Rita would have talked her through it. Dr. Howe was available. The hospital's ethics board existed precisely for situations like this. She made it alone because it was hers to make. She sat in the chair by her window at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, 11 days into their stay. 8 days since Lucy had first proposed a donation, and she thought about David. She thought about what David would have said. David Marsh had been, in all the years she'd known him, the most straightforwardly decent person she had ever encountered. Not perfect. He had faults, specific and familiar, the kind you catalog with love rather than criticism over years of genuine closeness. But decent in the bone-deep way, in the way that meant his first instinct in every situation was to ask what was right rather than what was safe. What would David say about a 10-year-old girl who wanted to give her kidney to a stranger in a prison uniform? She knew exactly what David would say. He would say, "She gets it from you, you know." She would say, "That's not helpful, David." He would say, "Yes, it is, because you already know the answer. You're just scared of it." She was scared of it. She was terrified of it, of the surgery, of the risk, of the possibility that in trying to save someone else's life her daughter might lose ground in her own battle faster than anticipated. But she was also, and this was the thing she had been sitting with for 8 days, the thing she kept turning over, she was also certain that Lucy was right. Not medically, not logistically, spiritually. Her daughter had looked at a man in a prison uniform in a hospital hallway and seen a person who needed help, and had decided, without agenda, without calculation, with the pure instinct of a child who hadn't learned yet to make those kinds of decisions based on what was convenient or safe, that she would help him. That was who Lucy was. And Caroline understood, sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, that preventing Lucy from being who she was, even in protection of her, even out of love, was not the right answer. She went to Dr. Howe's office at 7 the next morning. "Tell me," she said, "what we need to do to make this as safe as possible." Lucy recovered faster than anyone expected. This was Lucy, the compression of things into their most essential form. She had done the things she needed to do, and her body seemed to understand that there was more left to accomplish and moved accordingly. By the 3rd day, she was asking for her crayons. By the 5th day, she was asking to see Theo. Theo's recovery was slower. The kidney transplant was a significant procedure, and his body, worn from 3 years of institutional living and 4 months of advancing kidney failure, needed time to accept and adapt. But it did adapt. Dr. Howe called it remarkable. The nursing team called it wonderful. Donna, the morning nurse, called it exactly what she'd expected from the moment a little girl in a wheelchair had rolled herself into room 312 and put drawings on his wall. By the 2nd week, Theo was sitting up. By the 3rd, he was standing. By the 4th, he was walking the hallway with the careful, deliberate steps of someone relearning their own body. Lucy walked with him, or tried to. Her own breathing made extended walking difficult, and on the harder days, she was back in the wheelchair. But on the good days, she walked beside him down the 3rd-floor hallway, this tiny girl and this massive man, moving at the same careful pace for completely different reasons. Caroline walked behind them, watching. She had developed the habit of watching, of being present in a way that was slightly removed, because the alternative was to be so fully inside the feeling of what was happening that she couldn't function. She watched Lucy's small shoulders. She watched the way Theo adjusted his pace unconsciously to stay beside her. She watched his hands, which had begun to look different. She realized, in the past 4 weeks, less contained, less like they were being deliberately kept still. He had started to unfold. She watched that too. It happened on a Thursday evening. Lucy had had a difficult afternoon. The breathing, worse than it had been. Dr. Howe making notes with the careful expression of someone tracking something they had been expecting and had hoped would take longer to arrive. Lucy had been given additional medication and had fallen asleep at 6, earlier than usual. Caroline sat in the chair by the window of room 312. Theo sat in the bed. He was well enough to sit comfortably now. The kidney settled and functioning, his color better than it had been since the hallway. They sat in the quiet of Lucy's absence and talked. He told her the long version, not because he had decided to, or not only because he had decided to, because she was there, in the chair by the window, in the particular quality of her presence that he had come to depend on in a way he hadn't noticed until it was already true, and the long version had been waiting inside him long enough that it was ready to come out. He told her about Harlan Industries, about his father Edmund and what he'd built, about taking it over at 32 and what it had meant to him, the responsibility of it, the weight of it, the way he had tried to build it into something that would have made his father proud and done it in a way he himself could look at without flinching. He told her about Robert Paulson, about the friendship, the trust, the night of the accident, about standing in the rain on the expressway beside a car that had run into a barrier at 70 miles an hour, and understanding, before anyone told him, that Robert was gone. He told her about Vincent Cray, about the embezzlement that Robert had discovered, and that Vincent had silenced Robert to protect, about the evidence constructed against Theo with the patience and precision of someone who had planned it for months, about the trial. She listened without speaking. When he finished, she said, "Your legal team is still working on it?" "Yes. 3 years. Investigations of this complexity." He paused. "Vincent Cray is careful. He has resources. He has been very good at staying ahead of it." "But they're getting closer?" "My lead attorney called last month." She said close. She said close. He looked at the window. She's been saying close for a year. But this time it felt different. Caroline looked at him. "What happens when they prove it?" she said. "I go home," he said. "Simply. The conviction is overturned. I go home. To Chicago. To what's left of it." A pause. "The company has been managed by a board in my absence. It's intact. Changed, some things have changed, but intact." She was quiet. "Theo," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." He looked at her. "My husband," she said. "David." She paused, choosing the next words with the care she used for things that mattered. He worked in infrastructure engineering. For 8 years he worked on a project, a transit development in the Chicago area, before we moved to Cincinnati. Something shifted in Theo's expression, an alertness. "He worked," she said slowly, "for a company called Cray Infrastructure, which I believe." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Theo was very still. "Vincent Cray's company," he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had gone very quiet in the way of a man absorbing something large. "Yes," she said. A long silence. "David never." She stopped. "He was let go 2 years before we left Chicago. He said there were financial irregularities and he'd raised concerns, and they'd let him go." She looked at her hands. "I never connected it. Why would I? Cray Infrastructure was a separate company from Harlan. I didn't know the name Vincent Cray in any context that connected to you." "David raised concerns," Theo said. "About financial irregularities," she said. "In the infrastructure company." "Which would have been the same fraud," Theo said. "Cray was running it across multiple entities." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Your husband found it and was let go for it," she said. "And then died," he said. The room was very quiet. She looked at him, at the weight of what had just arrived in the space between them, the thread that connected her life to his that had been there all along, invisible until this moment. "I don't blame you," she said. "I want to say that first." "You should," he said. "No," she said firmly. "You didn't know. You were in prison. You didn't know what Cray did to David any more than I knew what he did to you." "He's connected to everything," Theo said. "Your husband, Robert, me." He looked at his hands, the hands that were finally unfolding. "All of it traces back to one man." "Yes," she said. "Caroline." He looked at her. "I need you to call my attorney." Margaret Cole had been Theodore Harlan's attorney for 9 years. She was 61, small, wore her gray hair short, and had the particular quality of a woman who had spent 4 decades in rooms where people underestimated her and had learned to use that consistently in her favor. She arrived at Mercy General on a Friday morning with a leather briefcase and the expression of a woman who had received a phone call that had rearranged something significant in her understanding of a case she had been living inside for 3 years. She met Caroline in the hallway outside room 312. "Ms. Marsh," she said, "I need to understand everything about your husband's employment at Cray Infrastructure. Every detail you can remember. Dates, names, any documentation he may have kept." Caroline looked at this small, precise woman. "David kept everything," she said. He was an engineer. He documented everything. Margaret Cole looked at her for a moment. Is the documentation accessible? She said. It's in boxes in my garage in Cincinnati, Caroline said. I've never opened them. I couldn't. She paused. After he died, I put the work boxes in the garage. I need those boxes, Margaret said. I'll call my neighbor, Caroline said. She has a key. Margaret opened her briefcase. I also need to tell you something, Ms. Marsh, about what David's documentation, if it contains what I believe it contains, would mean for Mr. Harlan's case. Tell me, Caroline said. Margaret told her. Lucy knew something was happening. She always knew. This was part of what made her Lucy. The antenna she had for the emotional weather of rooms. The way she tracked the people she loved with a precision that had nothing to do with explicit information and everything to do with attention. Something happened, she told Theo on Saturday morning. Between you and Mom. We talked, he said. I know you talked. You talk every night. She looked at him. This is different talking. He looked at this child. At the clear, direct eyes, the slightly labored breathing, the absolute certainty of her perception. Something may be changing, he said carefully. With my situation. The prison situation? Yes. She absorbed this. You might get to go home? Maybe. It's complicated. She nodded slowly. Then, does it have something to do with my dad? He was very still. What makes you ask that? He said carefully. Because Mom was crying last night, Lucy said. Not sad crying. The other kind. She paused. She only does the other kind when she's thinking about Dad in a good way. Theo looked at her. Yes, he said. It has something to do with your dad. Lucy considered this for a long moment. Dad was a good person, she said. He would want you to go home. You sound very sure of that. I am, she said. Because he was like me. He didn't care about the uniform. She looked at Theo steadily. He cared about the person. Theo looked at Lucy Marsh. He thought about the drawing on the wall. The two figures standing, no longer in wheelchairs. When we are better, he thought about David Marsh, who he had never met, who had found the fraud that Theo had spent 3 years paying for, who had been quietly and efficiently removed from the picture by the same man who had taken 3 years of Theo's life. He thought about a girl in a wheelchair in a hospital hallway who had said hey to a man in a prison uniform and changed the direction of everything. Thank you, Lucy, he said. For what? For saying hey. She smiled the full, complete smile that was her best feature and her whole face simultaneously. You looked lonely, she said. I couldn't just walk past. David Marsh had kept everything. The boxes arrived from Cincinnati on a Monday. 3 of them, taped and labeled in David's precise engineer's handwriting. Caroline's neighbor Rita had found them exactly where Caroline said they'd be, and had driven them herself, 4 hours each way, because that was the kind of friend Rita was. Margaret Cole opened them in the family consultation room at Mercy General, which the hospital had made available for the purpose, with Caroline beside her and a young associate named Daniel taking notes. What was in the boxes was, Margaret said afterward, in the measured language of an attorney, who had learned not to use words like extraordinary until she was completely certain, significant. David Marsh had been meticulous. 3 years of documentation from his time at Cray Infrastructure, emails, internal memos, financial records he had printed and kept because he understood, with the instinct of a man who had grown up watching his father navigate an unjust system, that the things people wanted to hide were exactly the things you needed to preserve. He had found the fraud 8 years ago. He had documented it. He had been let go before he could do anything with it. And then he had moved to Cincinnati and built a life, and the boxes had sat in a garage for 6 years, and then he had died, and the boxes had sat for 2 more years, and the connection between David Marsh of Cincinnati and Theodore Harlan of Westfield Correctional had existed in those boxes all along waiting. Margaret Cole called her office at 7 p.m. Prepare the appeal, she said. We have everything. December came to Mercy General the way December came everywhere, with lights in the windows, and a change in the quality of the light outside, and the particular emotional pressure of a season that asked everyone to account for their year. Lucy's condition had stabilized somewhat, not improved. Dr. Howe was careful about that word, but stabilized. The adjusted medication was managing the progression more effectively than the previous protocol. She was having more good days than bad days. On the good days, she was entirely herself, drawing, talking, moving through the hospital hallways with the particular energy of someone who had decided to use every good day completely. She was using them. She decorated Theo's room for Christmas. This was a project of considerable ambition that involved construction paper and tape, and the cooperation of Donna, the morning nurse, who turned out to have strong opinions about paper chain colors. The room was transformed over the course of 2 afternoons into something that looked less like a hospital room and more like the determined effort of a child who wanted someone she loved to feel that they were somewhere worth being. Theo sat in the middle of it and looked entirely unlike a man who had spent 3 years in Westfield Correctional. He looked like someone who had come home. Caroline watched this and felt the complicated, layered things she had been feeling since the long conversation, since the boxes, since Margaret's phone calls, since the growing certainty that the thread connecting her life to his was not a tragic coincidence, but a kind of strange, sorrowful grace. David had found the truth. He hadn't been able to use it. His daughter had found the man the truth was meant to free. She hadn't planned it. She had just said, hey. Caroline sat in the chair by the window of room 312. Her chair. She thought of it as a chair now, which said something she wasn't quite ready to say out loud, and watched her daughter put a paper star on top of a construction paper tree, and thought about David. You see this, she said, inside her head. You see her. She felt, not for the first time, that he did. Margaret Cole called on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. Theo answered on the first ring. Theodore, Margaret said, the appeal has been filed. The evidence from the Marsh documentation is substantial, and the court has agreed to expedited review, given the new material. A pause. Vincent Cray was arrested this morning. Chicago PD, in coordination with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. He is in custody. Theo sat very still. How long, he said. For the review? Weeks, not months. This is Theodore. This is the strongest exoneration case I've seen in 30 years of practice. The documentation is comprehensive. The connection to Cray is direct. The prosecution's original case was built on fabricated evidence, and I can now prove that fabrication. Weeks, he said. Weeks, she said. You're going home, Theodore. He sat in the room that Lucy had decorated for Christmas and looked at the paper star on top of the paper tree and said nothing for a moment. Margaret, he said. Yes. David Marsh, he said. The man whose documentation made this possible. His widow is here. His daughter is here. A pause. I know. Margaret said gently. I need you to. When this is done, I need to make sure. He stopped. They lost him because of Cray. David Marsh lost his job and his career trajectory because he tried to do the right thing. I need to make sure that's acknowledged. That there's something. One thing at a time, Margaret said. Let's get you out first. Yes, he said. He ended the call. He sat for a long moment. Then he got up, slowly, carefully, the body still relearning its own possibilities, and walked to the room 2 doors down where Lucy was finishing a drawing. Lucy, he said. She looked up. I'm going home, he said. Not today, but soon. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, the full smile, the one that was her whole face. I knew it, she said. I knew you'd be okay. She knew before he told her. She knew in the way she had come to know things about him, through the quality of his silence, through the specific way he looked at her when he was holding something he hadn't said yet. He found her in the hallway that afternoon. Walk with me, he said. They walked the 3rd floor hallway, slowly, the way they walked when Lucy wasn't with them, without the pace of a child setting the rhythm, just their own pace, which turned out to be the same. He told her about Margaret's call, about Vincent Cray's arrest, about the weeks. She listened. When he finished, she said, I'm glad. Are you? He looked at her. There's something. He paused. There's something I need to say. Say it. Your husband, he said. What David found, what he tried to do, and what it cost him. I cannot fix that. I know that. I know there's no. He stopped. But what I can do, when I'm out, when the company is back in my hands, I want to make sure that his name is part of the record. That what he did is acknowledged. That Lucy knows her father was the person who ultimately made this right. Caroline looked at this man, at everything he was, and everything he had been through, and the careful, precise way he was trying to say something that he didn't have perfect words for. She already knows her father was a good person, she said. She should know he was a brave one too, Theo said, and that it mattered. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said. They walked in silence for a moment. Then he said, Caroline, can I ask you something? Yes. What happens after this? After I go home? He was very deliberate. I don't want to assume. I don't want to. He stopped. I haven't had much practice at this. At what? At asking for what I want, he said, without knowing how it will be received. She stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him in the December hallway of Mercy General. This massive, careful, honest man who had cried over her daughter's drawing, and made terrible coffee, and told her the truth about everything when she asked, and thought about the chair by the window of room 312, and how it had come to feel like the right place to be. Ask, she said. He looked at her steadily. I would like, he said, to know you outside of here, outside of hospitals and prison uniforms, and he gestured at the hallway around them. Outside of all of this. You mean when you're home? She said. Yes. In Chicago. Yes. Though I would come to Cincinnati. If that's... Theo, she said. Yes. Ask me properly. He looked at her. Will you let me know you? He said. When I'm out. When this is over. Will you let me try? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about David. About the grief that was always present. The shape of it familiar now. Something she had learned to carry rather than something that carried her. About what it meant to love someone and lose them and then find yourself, unexpectedly, in a hospital hallway, feeling something you hadn't planned to feel again. She thought about Lucy, who had said, hey. Yes, she said. He exhaled. Yes, she said again. Obviously yes. Theodore Harlan was exonerated on January 8th. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The evidence was, as Margaret had said, comprehensive. The judge's language in overturning the conviction was unusually direct. The court acknowledged explicitly that the original prosecution had been built on fabricated evidence, constructed by Vincent Cray, who had by this point been formally charged with fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in connection with the death of Robert Paulson. Theo walked out of the courthouse in Chicago on a January morning in a suit that Margaret's office had organized because his own suits were 3 years out of reach. He stood on the courthouse steps. Chicago in January was cold in the particular way of flat Midwestern cities. The wind coming off the lake with nothing to stop it. The gray sky pressing down. The city going about its business with the indifference of a place that had seen everything before. He stood there for a moment. He breathed the air. He called Caroline. It's done, he said. A pause. Come home, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped. I don't know where that is yet. You'll figure it out, she said. Lucy drew something for you. She made me take a picture. I'm sending it now. His phone buzzed. He looked at the image. The 2 figures again. Standing, no wheelchairs. A third figure between them, small, with arms stretched to both sides, holding their hands. Above them, in Lucy's lettering U.S., he stood on the courthouse steps in Chicago in January and looked at that drawing for a long time. He came to Cincinnati on a Saturday in February. He drove. He had a car again. One of the things that returned to you when the world gave you back. And he came into Cincinnati on a gray Saturday morning with flowers he'd bought at a gas station in Columbus because he hadn't planned when to stop, and the gas station flowers were what was available, and he had decided that arriving with gas station flowers was more honest than arriving without any. Caroline opened the door. She looked at the flowers. Gas station, she said. Columbus, he said. She smiled. She stepped back and let him in. The house was exactly what he had imagined from her descriptions. Warm, specific. The accumulated presence of a family's life. A child's drawings on the refrigerator. A photograph of David on the mantel. A coat rack by the door with small coats and large coats, and the organized chaos of a household run by one person who was very good at it. Lucy appeared at the top of the stairs. She was wearing pajamas and had apparently decided that the appropriate response to Theo's arrival was to come downstairs immediately regardless of being dressed. She looked at him from the third stair. "You're bigger outside the hospital," she said. "You're smaller," he said. "That's not how it works," she said. "No," he said. "You're exactly right." She came down the stairs and hugged him, both arms around his midsection, her head reaching approximately his sternum, a hug of complete and uncomplicated warmth. He put his hand carefully on the top of her head. He stood in Caroline Marsh's house in Cincinnati in February, with gas station flowers in one hand and a 10-year-old girl's arms around him, and felt something he did not have a name for and did not need one. He was home. The months that followed were not simple. Simple was not what any of them had signed up for. Lucy, who had never wanted simple, Caroline, who had learned that simple was a description for lives that hadn't been tested yet, Theo, who had spent 3 years in a place that had stripped everything down to its irreducible elements and found that what remained, underneath everything, was the desire to be real. He came to Cincinnati most weekends. He worked from Chicago during the week. Harlan Industries, restored to him by the board who had managed it carefully in his absence, was a company he was relearning the way you relearn things after an interruption, finding what had changed and what had held and what needed to be rebuilt. He established a foundation in David Marsh's name, a fund for whistleblowers in financial and infrastructure industries, people who found the fraud and raised the alarm and needed protection and support when the system turned on them for it. He announced it publicly, with Caroline present, and said David Marsh's name clearly in the press statement and explained exactly what David had done and why it had mattered. Lucy went to the announcement. She wore her good dress and sat in the front row, and when a journalist asked her afterward how she felt about her father being honored, she said, "He was brave. I always knew. Now everyone knows." She was 11 by then. Almost 12, she would have said. Her condition was progressing. Dr. Howe's word, the careful word. The good days were still good, and on them Lucy was entirely herself, drawing and talking and moving through the world with the completeness of someone who had decided to use every moment of every good day. The hard days were harder than they used to be. Caroline managed all of it with the grace that was not grace but necessity. And Theo was there more and more, the weekends becoming longer, the weeks between becoming shorter, the distance between Cincinnati and Chicago becoming increasingly theoretical. He asked Caroline to marry him on a Sunday in October. Not dramatically, not with a restaurant or an event or the performed grandeur of someone trying to make a moment. He asked her in her kitchen, over the coffee she made because his was still genuinely terrible, on a Sunday morning when Lucy was drawing at the kitchen table and the house was full of the ordinary sounds of people living in it. He said, "I want to stay." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "You want to stay?" she said. "Permanently," he said. "If that's—" "Yes," Lucy said, without looking up from her drawing. Caroline looked at her daughter. "I wasn't asking you," Theo said. "I know," Lucy said, "but the answer is yes." Caroline looked at Theo. "The answer is yes," she said. Lucy died on a Thursday in March. She was 11 years and 4 months old. It was not a sudden thing. The progression had accelerated in February, Dr. Howe tracking it with the careful honesty she had maintained from the beginning. Caroline managing each new piece of information with the discipline of a woman who had been managing impossible things for 4 years. Lucy knew. She had known for a while, in the way she knew things, clearly, without drama, with the acceptance of someone who had been living close to this truth long enough to have made a kind of peace with it. She spent the last good days drawing. She left drawings for everyone. For Caroline, a large one, the two of them holding hands, my amom written above in letters larger than the figures. For Theo, the figure standing again, the 3 of them now my family. For Dr. Howe, who received a drawing of a stethoscope and a heart, and the words "you tried." For Donna, the morning nurse, who had taped 7 drawings on the wall of room 312, and who received a drawing of tape and paper with the word Donna underlined 3 times. She asked to go back to Mercy General in the last week, which surprised no one who knew her. She wanted to be where the story had been, where she had wheeled herself down a hallway and said, "Hey." They brought her back. Room 312 was available. She died in room 312 on a Thursday morning with Caroline holding one hand and Theo holding the other. She did not say anything dramatic. She said, "I'm glad I said hey." And then she went to sleep and did not wake up. They cried, both of them, Caroline and Theo, in a way that had nothing controlled or managed about it. The particular abandon of grief that arrived when you had loved someone completely and lost them completely, and the gap between those two things was too large for anything except complete surrender to it. Donna, the morning nurse, came in and held Caroline's hand for a while and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Dr. Howe came and said what Doctor said, carefully and kindly. And it was kind, but it was not what anyone needed. What they needed was Lucy. And Lucy was gone. They sat in room 312 for a long time after. The drawings were still on the wall. Donna had never taken them down, and new ones had been added over the months. A whole wall of Lucy's versions of the world, her two figures standing, her careful lettering, her complete and particular vision of what mattered. Theo looked at the drawings. He thought about the kidney she had given him, functioning inside him. He could feel it, or he imagined he could. The presence of a gift that was also a piece of a person he had loved. He thought about the hallway and the wheelchair and the hay that had changed everything. He thought, she is in me. She will always be in me. He took Caroline's hand. She held it. They sat in room 312 until the evening light changed and the city outside the window moved through its ordinary business, and the world went on in the way it always did, indifferent to the specific losses of specific people in specific rooms. But they were not indifferent. They were two people who had loved a child who loved everyone, and who had been changed by that love in ways they were still discovering, and who would carry her, in one case literally, in one case in every other way that mattered, for the rest of their lives. They were married in May. Not a large wedding. 30 people, because Lucy would have found a large wedding excessive, and they both knew it. And because the people who mattered could fit in a room, and the people who couldn't fit in a room didn't matter enough to restructure everything for. Cincinnati. The church where David was buried nearby, where Caroline had been a member for 12 years, where Lucy had been baptized as a baby, and had drawn pictures of the stained glass windows from memory when she was 7. It was warm for May. The light came through those stained glass windows and made patterns on the floor, the way light does in old churches, specific and ancient, and completely indifferent to the human events happening below it, and somehow more beautiful for that indifference. Caroline wore a dress the color of cream. Theo wore a suit that was not from a prison issue or a courthouse emergency, and fit him the way things fit when they've been chosen rather than assigned. Rita was maid of honor. She cried twice before the ceremony started, and was not embarrassed about either time. Margaret Cole was in the third row, and wore an expression of profound satisfaction. The vows were written by themselves. Caroline said, "I vow to keep choosing, even when it's hard, even when it's complicated, even when the world looks like it has other plans. I choose this. I choose you. And I choose to believe that the people we've lost are not gone. They are the reason we found each other." Theo said, "I vow to spend every day being worthy of what was given to me." By a little girl who said hey to a stranger in a hallway and did not care what he was wearing. By a man who told the truth when it cost him everything. And by you, who sat in the chair by the window and stayed. A pause. I carry them with me. I will always carry them. And I will carry you. He touched his side when he said I carry them. Nobody who knew the story missed it. On the table at the reception, beside the wedding cake, were 2 framed drawings. 1, 2 figures standing, no wheelchairs. When we are better. 2, 3 figures standing, holding hands. My family. Lucy's lettering. Lucy's vision. She was there. She was always going to be there. She said, hey. That's all it took. A 10-year-old girl in a wheelchair in a hospital hallway looked at a man in a prison uniform that everyone else was carefully ignoring and said, hey. She didn't know he was worth $3 billion. She didn't know his name would clear itself and his empire would return to him, and the man who had taken his freedom would eventually face the truth he had been running from. She didn't know that the documentation her own father had kept in boxes in a garage in Cincinnati would be the thing that finally broke the case open. She didn't know any of it. She just knew that he looked lonely, and that lonely was something she understood. and that the only reasonable response to someone who was lonely and sick and sitting in a hallway being ignored was to say, hey. Theodore Harlan carries Lucy Marsh inside him. Not as a metaphor, not a sentiment. Actually, physically, her kidney. The one she fought her parents for the right to give. The one she gave at 10 years old to a stranger in a prison uniform because she decided he was worth saving. Keeps him alive. Every day. He built a foundation in David Marsh's name. He married Caroline in May. He goes to the cemetery on Lucy's birthday every year and brings crayons, a whole box, the big one with 64 colors, and leave them at her headstone because she always said the small boxes were limiting. Caroline says he talks to her when he thinks nobody's watching. He says he doesn't. She knows he does. And Lucy, wherever she is probably not surprised. She always knew he was worth talking to. If this story moved you, if Lucy moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to Golden Veil Stories. Ring the bell. We have more stories where this came from. Stories about love that arrives in impossible places. About wealth that turns out to mean nothing, and people who turn out to mean everything. About the small moments, the hay in a hallway, the chair by the window, the gas station flowers in February, that turn out to be the whole story. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have said hey? I'll be reading every single one. This is Golden Veil Stories. The best part is always what happens next.